November 19, 1940. The darkness over southern England was absolute. A moonless, impenetrable blackness that swallowed everything beneath it. At 20,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham eased his Bristol Beaufighter through the frozen air, his breath clouding inside the cramped cockpit. Behind him, in the aircraft's belly, Sergeant John Phillipson hunched over a small green radar screen, watching ghostly blips flicker and fade like dying embers. They had been airborne for 90 minutes, guided by ground controllers toward a German bomber stream that was even now dropping high explosives on Birmingham. Cunningham's gloved hands gripped the control column as Phillipson's voice crackled through the intercom. Contact. 2 miles. Dead ahead. What happened in the next 4 minutes would mark the beginning of a technological revolution that would fundamentally alter the nature of aerial warfare. The Beaufighter closed silently on a Junkers Ju-88, its crew completely unaware of the predator stalking them from the void. At 400 yards, Cunningham identified his target visually. A dark silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. He closed to 200 yards, centered the bomber in his gun sight, and pressed the firing button. 20mm Hispano cannons and 6 Browning machine guns erupted simultaneously, and the Junkers exploded in a brilliant orange fireball that momentarily turned night into day. It was the first confirmed kill using airborne interception radar, the first time an enemy aircraft had been destroyed by a weapon they literally never saw coming. For the German bomber crews who survived that winter and the terrible months that followed, the experience was nothing short of supernatural. They spoke in hushed, terrified voices of an enemy that struck from nowhere, without warning, without sound, without even the telltale glow of exhaust flames that might betray an approaching fighter. One moment a bomber would be droning steadily through the darkness toward its target, the crew confident in the protection that night provided. The next moment, cannon shells would tear through aluminum skin, fuel tanks would ignite, and men would be fighting desperately to abandon an aircraft already committed to its death dive. The survivors, those few who managed to parachute into the cold English countryside or limp home across the channel with shattered aircraft, told stories that their intelligence officers initially dismissed as panic and imagination. They described attacks that came from directly astern and below, the blind spot where no gunner could return fire, delivered with mechanical precision by an enemy that seemed able to see perfectly in total darkness. The Luftwaffe called them Nachtgespenst, night ghosts. They were right to be afraid. The desperate problem that Britain faced in the autumn of 1940 was existential and seemingly insoluble. The Royal Air Force had won the Battle of Britain during daylight hours, turning back the Luftwaffe's attempt to achieve air superiority as a precursor to invasion. But when the sun set, British defenses became almost completely ineffective. The Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes that had performed so brilliantly in daylight were nearly useless after dark. Traditional fighter tactics relied entirely on visual identification. A pilot spotting an enemy aircraft silhouetted against clouds or landscape, then maneuvering into firing position. In complete darkness at 20,000 feet, with no moon and perhaps total cloud cover below, this was virtually impossible. Fighter pilots would be vectored toward German bomber streams by ground controllers watching radar screens, but once they got close, within 2 or 3 miles, they were entirely on their own. They would search the blackness desperately, hoping to spot an exhaust flame or catch a silhouette against the stars. Most times they saw nothing. The German bombers would complete their runs, drop their payloads on British cities, and disappear back across the channel completely untouched. The statistics were humiliating and terrifying in equal measure. In the early months of the Blitz, RAF night fighters were shooting down less than 2% of German raiders. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire accounted for most German losses, and even those numbers were minimal. On the night of November 14, 1940, when the Luftwaffe devastated Coventry in one of the most destructive raids of the war, RAF Fighter Command flew 119 sorties but failed to shoot down a single German bomber. Between September 1940 and May 1941, approximately 41,000 tons of bombs fell on Britain, with more than 18,000 tons striking London alone. Around 41,000 people were killed, with 21,000 of those deaths in the capital. 2 million homes were damaged or destroyed, 60% of them in London. The Luftwaffe was operating with near impunity, and Britain's cities were being systematically destroyed while the RAF could do little more than bear witness to the carnage from above. The civilian population endured horrors that would scar an entire generation. On the night of May 10, 1941, the last and worst raid of the Blitz, 571 sorties were flown by German bombers, with some crews flying 2 or even 3 missions. 711 tons of high-explosive bombs and more than 86,000 incendiaries rained down on London. The London Fire Brigade recorded at least 2,136 fires, including 9 of conflagration-level firestorms that generated their own weather systems. Approximately 1,436 people were killed and 1,800 seriously injured. The fires consumed 700 acres of the city, roughly double the area destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. Against this onslaught, anti-aircraft guns expended 4,500 rounds and claimed just 2 bombers destroyed. Fighter Command dispatched 325 aircraft and claimed 28 enemy aircraft shot down, though actual German losses were only 12. The brutal mathematics were inescapable. Britain was losing the night war, and there seemed to be no solution in sight. The unlikely solution to this crisis, and the architect who drove it forward against institutional resistance and technical obstacles that would have defeated lesser men, was a Welsh physicist named Edward George Bowen. Born in 1911, Bowen had joined the radio research team at Bawdsey Manor in 1936, where Robert Watson Watt's group was pioneering radar technology. While others focused on ground-based early warning systems, the chain home stations that would prove so vital during the Battle of Britain, Bowen became obsessed with a seemingly impossible challenge: miniaturizing radar equipment enough to fit it into an aircraft and make it work reliably in the violent, vibration-filled environment of aerial combat. The idea was dismissed by many as impractical. Radar sets of the era were enormous, temperamental devices that filled entire rooms and required constant adjustment by skilled operators. The notion that such equipment could be shrunk down, made rugged enough to survive the stresses of flight and combat, and operated by aircrew who were simultaneously flying and fighting seemed like pure fantasy. But Bowen was convinced it could be done, and he possessed the rare combination of theoretical brilliance and practical engineering skill necessary to prove it. He assembled a small team and began work on what would become known as AI, Airborne Interception Radar. The first complete installation was flown in a ferry battle on June 9, 1939, just 3 months before the outbreak of war. It gave a maximum range of 12,000 feet with a minimum range of about 1,000 feet, and in mock interceptions the display seemed relatively easy to use. A week later, Bowen demonstrated the system to Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief of RAF Fighter Command. Dowding, who possessed a keen appreciation for technology that many senior officers lacked, immediately recognized the potential. Within weeks, Bowen's group was committed to fitting AI radar into 30 Bristol Blenheims for trials by No. 25 Squadron at Northolt. The battle of development that followed was grueling and nearly ended in complete failure multiple times. The initial program at Northolt was premature, the AI equipment was inadequately engineered, and no proper provision had been made for training and maintenance. The sets failed constantly. Pilots and radar operators struggled to interpret the displays. The Blenheim fighters themselves lacked the speed and climb rate to effectively intercept modern German bombers. The entire project seemed doomed, and there were powerful voices within the Air Ministry calling for it to be abandoned as a waste of precious resources. But the trials exposed one critical fact that would change everything. In order to make successful interceptions with AI, it was essential to control the path of the fighter with a precision that could not be achieved by the existing system of fighter control. Ground controllers needed their own specialized radar that could track both friendly fighters and enemy bombers simultaneously, allowing them to guide the interceptor to within a few miles of the target before the airborne radar took over. Bowen immediately saw the solution and wrote a memorandum suggesting that a special radar should be developed for fighter control, a system with a narrow rotating beam that he called a radio lighthouse. He had actually suggested such a system back in July 1938, but the idea had been rejected. This time, with the desperate circumstances of late 1940 lending urgency to the request, the proposal was approved. Development proceeded on what would become Ground-Controlled Interception Radar, or GCI, and the first system was delivered to the RAF in October 1940. Meanwhile, Bowen's team continued refining the airborne equipment. They developed an improved version designated AI-Mk3, which was further engineered at the Royal Aircraft Establishment and introduced into service as AI-Mk4 in Blenheims and Beaufighters in the autumn of 1940. The AI-Mk4 was a remarkable piece of technology for its era, though by modern standards it seems almost impossibly crude. It operated on meter wavelengths with a maximum detection range of about 3 miles and a minimum range of around 400 feet. Any closer and the returns would be lost in ground clutter or the radar's own blind spot. The display showed range and bearing information on 2 separate oscilloscope screens that the radar operator had to interpret simultaneously while being thrown around by turbulence and evasive maneuvers. It required constant adjustment and tuning, and the external antenna arrays, distinctive arrow-shaped transmitters mounted on the nose and receiver antennas on the wings, created significant drag that reduced the aircraft's performance. But despite these limitations, in the hands of a skilled crew, AI-Mk4 was remarkably effective. It was the last and vital link in an elaborate system of hunting enemy bombers that involved coastal chain-home radar stations, inland GCI radars, radio beacons and transponders, VHF radio communications, and AI-equipped Beaufighters with their 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 6.303 Browning machine guns. The aircraft that would carry this revolutionary technology into battle and transform the night skies over Britain was the Bristol Beaufighter, and its timing was extraordinarily fortunate. The Beaufighter's introduction coincided almost exactly with the Luftwaffe's switch to night bombing in early September 1940, and it arrived early enough to be equipped with the first operational AI radar sets in autumn of that year. Crucially, it also arrived late enough to avoid being squandered in the hopeless Battle of France or misdeployed during the Battle of Britain, like its underpowered predecessor, the Bristol Blenheim. The Beaufighter was a brute of an aircraft, large, heavy, and immensely powerful, with 2 Bristol Hercules radial engines producing 1,700 horsepower each. It was fast enough at 320 miles per hour to catch any German bomber, heavily armed enough to destroy one with a single burst, and it had the range and endurance to patrol for hours waiting for targets. It could carry a pilot and radar operator in relative comfort, with enough space for the bulky AI equipment and its operators. Beaufighters became operational in September 1940, and during the winter their numbers increased rapidly, reaching 100 aircraft by the end of the year and 200 by May 1941. Production of AI-Mk4 more than kept pace, and the improved radar was retrofitted to most of the early Mki aircraft that had been delivered without it. But technology alone was not enough. The entire system, ground controllers, radar operators, pilots, and the equipment itself, had to work in perfect harmony, and achieving that harmony required months of painful trial and error. Night fighting was uniquely difficult, perhaps the most demanding form of aerial combat ever devised. A ground controller had to interpret radar returns that might be distorted by atmospheric conditions, identify which blips were enemy bombers and which were friendly fighters, and guide the interceptor onto a converging course. The pilot had to fly accurately on instruments in total darkness, often in bad weather and heavy turbulence, while maintaining radio contact with ground control. The radar operator had to keep the target on his screens, calling out heading corrections while interpreting displays that could be maddeningly ambiguous. Then, when the range closed to visual distance, perhaps 300 or 400 yards on a dark night, the pilot had to acquire the target visually, identify it positively as hostile, maneuver into firing position without losing sight of it, and deliver an accurate burst of cannon fire, all while the bomber might be taking evasive action. Until this complex dance was mastered, neither a GCI controller nor an aircrew could ever say they were truly in control of the situation. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Many early interceptions failed because the fighter pilot simply couldn't see the bomber even when the radar showed it was right in front of him. Others failed because the target took evasive action at the critical moment and disappeared. Still others failed because of equipment malfunctions or human error. But then, gradually, 1 or 2 exceptional crews began to work with gifted controllers, and the whole system started to click. The first operational AI radar kill was scored on November 19, 1940, as described in our opening scene. The second came on November 7th, scored by the same pilot who had achieved the first, Flying Officer John Cunningham. These early successes proved the concept, and as more crews gained experience, the kill rate began to climb steadily. John Cunningham himself would become a legend, the RAF's poster boy for night fighting, though for security reasons the true source of his success had to be concealed. The Ministry of Information launched an elaborate disinformation campaign, claiming that Cunningham's extraordinary night vision was due to a diet rich in carrots, which were high in vitamin A. The story was absurd on its face. No amount of carrots could enable someone to see a black aircraft against a black sky at several hundred yards, but the British public, desperate for heroes and willing to believe in homegrown ingenuity over German technology, embraced it eagerly. Cunningham became known as Cat's Eyes Cunningham, and the carrot myth entered popular culture so thoroughly that many people still believe it today. The real secret, of course, was AI radar, and the disinformation served a dual purpose. It maintained security around a vital military technology while simultaneously encouraging British civilians to eat more carrots, which were not rationed and helped supplement a wartime diet that was increasingly monotonous. The tactics that Cunningham and other successful night fighter crews developed were brutally effective. The Cunningham-Rawnsley team, Cunningham flew with radar operator C.F. Rawnsley, used the AI radar to position themselves directly astern and underneath the target. Although German bombers carried dorsal gunners, it was extremely difficult to locate an enemy fighter against the black landscape far below. The blackness of the countryside would swallow up the outline of an approaching night fighter, rendering it effectively invisible. Approaching from slightly below also allowed Cunningham to avoid the bomber's slipstream, which could be violent enough to throw a following aircraft out of control. These tactics allowed him to close to point-blank range and fire first, which was usually sufficient to end the engagement quickly and successfully. By the end of the war, Cunningham had been promoted to group captain and was credited with 20 aerial victories, 19 of them at night, making him the highest-scoring RAF night fighter pilot until he was surpassed in 1945. As the new system came online and crews gained proficiency, the results were dramatic. In March 1941, 22 German bombers were shot down. In April, the figure was 48. In May, almost 100 enemy aircraft were destroyed by RAF night fighters, a success rate that would have seemed impossible just 6 months earlier. The impact on Luftwaffe operations was immediate and profound. German bomber crews, who had grown accustomed to operating with near impunity in the darkness, suddenly found themselves facing an invisible enemy that could strike without warning. Losses began to mount, morale plummeted, and the effectiveness of the night bombing campaign deteriorated sharply. By May 1941, when German night raids tailed off as Luftwaffe bomber units were redeployed eastward in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Blitz had effectively been defeated, not primarily by anti-aircraft guns or barrage balloons, but by a relative handful of radar-equipped night fighters that had transformed the night skies from a German sanctuary into a hunting ground. The enemy's fatal blind spot was not simply tactical or technological. It was rooted in a fundamental failure of imagination and intelligence that would haunt the Luftwaffe for the remainder of the war. German intelligence had been aware of British radar development since before the war began. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft had photographed the distinctive chain home towers that lined Britain's coasts, and German scientists had correctly identified them as radio detection equipment. But the Germans consistently underestimated the sophistication of British radar technology and, more critically, failed to grasp how rapidly it was advancing. They knew about ground-based radar but dismissed the possibility of effective airborne interception radar, believing that the equipment could never be made small enough, reliable enough, or sufficiently precise to be operationally useful. This was partly arrogance, a conviction that German science and engineering were inherently superior, and partly a failure of analysis. When Luftwaffe bomber crews began reporting night fighter attacks that seemed impossibly accurate, German intelligence officers were skeptical. They attributed the reports to the unreliability of eyewitness testimony under stress, to exaggeration by crews trying to explain their failures, or to lucky encounters by British pilots with exceptional night vision. The Germans developed their own airborne radar, designated FUG 202 Liechtenstein B/C, but it lagged approximately 2 years behind British developments and didn't enter widespread service until 1942. Even then, the Luftwaffe primarily deployed it on their own night fighters defending against RAF bomber streams over occupied Europe, rather than understanding it as a technology that had already defeated their night bombing campaign against Britain. German defensive doctrine in 1940 and early 1941 relied on the Himmelbett system, a line of radar stations running from Denmark to France, each covering a zone approximately 18 miles wide and equipped with Freya early warning radars and Würzburg tracking radars. The system worked by assigning one night fighter to each zone, with ground controllers using the radars to guide the fighter toward incoming bombers. But the Himmelbett system had critical limitations. Each zone could only handle one interception at a time, and the radars had limited range and accuracy. The British quickly learned to exploit these weaknesses by concentrating their bomber streams, overwhelming individual zones by sheer numbers. The fundamental problem was that the Germans were fighting yesterday's war, relying on ground-based systems and visual interception techniques, while the British had leaped ahead to a new paradigm of radar-guided night fighting. By the time the Luftwaffe fully understood what they were facing and began to develop countermeasures, the strategic situation had shifted entirely. The reversal came in the winter of 1940-41, and it was absolute. The first major operational successes using the integrated system of GCI radar and AI-equipped Beaufighters occurred in March 1941, and German bomber crews immediately noticed the change. Suddenly, interceptions that had previously been rare became common. Bombers that had survived dozens of missions were being shot down in flames before their crews even knew a fighter was nearby. The psychological impact was devastating. Previously, bomber crews had been confident that darkness provided protection. Now, darkness meant nothing. The enemy could see them when they were blind, could track them when they were invisible, could kill them when they had no warning and no chance to defend themselves. The night of April 10, 1941, provides a stark example of the new reality. The Luftwaffe launched a major raid on Birmingham, sending more than 200 bombers. RAF night fighters intercepted the stream and shot down 21 aircraft, nearly 10% of the attacking force, a loss rate that was unsustainable for any air force. On May 3rd to 4th, another large raid on Liverpool saw 33 German bombers destroyed, again roughly 10% of the force. These were not the isolated lucky kills that had characterized earlier night fighting. They were systematic, efficient destruction that demonstrated complete British air superiority in the night skies over England. The Beaufighter AI combination was achieving what no one had thought possible. It was making night bombing as dangerous as daylight operations. From the German perspective, the experience was nightmarish. Bomber crews would be flying their assigned routes, navigating by radio beams, approaching their targets with bomb bay doors opening, and then, without warning, cannon shells would tear through the aircraft from behind and below. The first indication of danger would be the impact of explosive rounds detonating in fuel tanks, engines, or the crew compartment. There was no time to take evasive action, often no time even to return fire. Survivors described it as being hunted by ghosts, by an enemy that could see perfectly in conditions where human vision was useless. Some crews reported seeing mysterious aircraft with strange antenna arrays, the distinctive AI radar antennas of the Beaufighters, but many never saw their attackers at all. They would simply find themselves in a burning aircraft, with seconds to bail out before it exploded. The expansion of the night fighter system and its multi-role impact demonstrated the full scope of the revolution that Bowen's radar had unleashed. In the spring of 1942, a new aircraft joined the Beaufighter in equipping Fighter Command's night fighter squadrons, the de Havilland Mosquito. The Mosquito was an extraordinary machine, a twin-engine fighter bomber constructed primarily of wood to conserve strategic materials, yet capable of speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. It was fast, agile, heavily armed, and could carry the latest AI radar equipment with ease. The Mosquito arrived at an opportune moment. RAF bomber command raids on Lübeck and Rostock in February and March 1942 had prompted an enraged Hitler to order retaliatory bombing attacks against Britain. The so-called Baedeker raids, named after a 19th-century German guidebook and directed against Britain's most historic and less well-defended towns and cities including York, Norwich, Bath, and Canterbury, began in April 1942. But the Luftwaffe was no longer facing the weak, ineffective defenses of 1940. Britain's night fighter force was now formidable, equipped with both Beaufighters and Mosquitoes, supported by an extensive network of GCI radar stations, and crewed by men who had mastered the demanding art of radar-guided interception. The Baedeker raids were a disaster for Germany. Damage to British cities was minimal, while 40 German bombers were shot down. A catastrophic loss rate that demonstrated beyond any doubt that the Luftwaffe had lost the night war over Britain. The raids were quickly abandoned, and Germany never again attempted a sustained strategic bombing campaign against the British Isles. The night fighters' role expanded far beyond defensive operations over Britain. Mosquitoes flew deep penetration, Ranger sorties over occupied Europe, seeking out enemy aircraft or ground targets. They flew intruder missions to German airfields, lurking in the darkness and pouncing on aircraft as they attempted to land or take off. Some Mosquitoes joined RAF heavy bomber streams on missions over Germany, using their radar to hunt Luftwaffe night fighters that were attempting to intercept the bombers. This cat-and-mouse game in the darkness over the Reich represented the ultimate expression of radar-guided night fighting. Fighters hunting fighters, with both sides equipped with increasingly sophisticated detection and countermeasures equipment. By 1943, the technological advantage had decisively shifted to the Allies, particularly with the introduction of centimetric radar using the cavity magnetron. This device, invented by British scientists John Randall and Harry Boot at Birmingham University in 1940, enabled radar sets to operate at much shorter wavelengths, around 10 centimeters instead of the meter-plus wavelengths of earlier systems. Centimetric radar offered dramatically improved resolution and range in equipment that was smaller and lighter than the earlier meter wave sets. The AI Mk8 radar, which entered service in 1942, represented a quantum leap in capability. It gave night fighter crews the ability to detect and track targets at ranges of up to 5 miles with much greater precision and reliability than the earlier AI Mk4. Edward Bowen himself played a crucial role in spreading this technology to Britain's allies. In August 1940, he had been one of 7 members of the TIZARD mission to the United States and Canada, tasked with disclosing recent British technical advances in exchange for American industrial and scientific cooperation. Bowen took with him not only information on all existing and projected radar equipment but also an early sample of the cavity magnetron, the essential and highly secret key to centimetric radar that would transform the Allied war effort. The Americans, who had their own radar programs but were behind British developments in several key areas, were astonished by the magnetron's performance. It became the foundation for a massive expansion of radar production and development in the United States, leading to systems that would be used on American fighters, bombers, and ships for the remainder of the war. The psychological aftermath of Britain's night fighter victory reverberated through both air forces for the remainder of the war. For the Luftwaffe, the trauma of the failed Blitz and the subsequent disasters of the Baedeker raids fundamentally altered their strategic calculations. The night bombing campaign against Britain, which Hitler had hoped would break civilian morale and force a negotiated peace, had instead consumed bomber units that were desperately needed on other fronts. When Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched in June 1941, the Luftwaffe was forced to transfer the bulk of its bomber force eastward, leaving behind the shattered remnants of units that had been mauled over England. The psychological impact on surviving crews was profound. Many of the most experienced bomber pilots and navigators had been killed, and those who survived carried with them the knowledge that they had faced an enemy they could neither see nor effectively fight. This trauma would manifest again when the Luftwaffe found itself on the defensive, attempting to protect German cities against RAF Bomber Command's strategic offensive. German night fighter crews, equipped with their own airborne radar and fighting over their homeland, would prove highly effective, but they were always playing catch-up to British technology, always one step behind in the deadly dance of detection and evasion. For the RAF, the victory transformed institutional culture and strategic thinking. The night fighter force became an elite within the service, attracting some of the best pilots and crews. Wing Commander Brance Burbridge, who began his operational career in late 1943, would eventually surpass even John Cunningham's record to become the highest-scoring RAF night fighter ace of the war with 21 aerial victories, all achieved at night. Burbridge flew with radar operator Bill Skelton in a Mosquito, and their partnership exemplified the seamless coordination between pilot and operator that made the system work. On February 22 to 23, 1944, they destroyed a Messerschmitt Me 410 southeast of Beachy Head during a Luftwaffe raid on London. Over the following months, they systematically destroyed German bombers with mechanical efficiency. Dornier Du 217s, Junkers Ju 88s, Ju 188s, more Me 410s, until by January 1945, Burbridge had passed Cunningham's total to claim the record. 15. Burbridge's success, and that of dozens of other night fighter aces, was built on the foundation that Bowen and his team had laid in those desperate months of 1940. The technology had evolved. AI Mk8 and later AI Mk9 radar were far superior to the crude Mk4 sets that had equipped the first operational Beaufighters, but the fundamental principle remained the same. Radar allowed night fighters to detect, track, and close with targets that were invisible to the naked eye, transforming darkness from an enemy into an ally. The tactic of approaching from astern and below, which Cunningham had pioneered, remained standard throughout the war because it was simply the most effective way to exploit the blind spots of enemy bombers. The only significant change was that German crews eventually learned what they were facing and developed a healthy terror of the invisible hunters that stalked them through the darkness. The enduring legacy of RAF night fighters and AI radar extends far beyond the specific battles of World War II. The technology and tactics developed in those desperate years laid the foundation for every subsequent generation of radar-equipped interceptors. The AI naming convention continued in the post-war era, with systems like the AI.18 used on the de Havilland Sea Vixen and the AI.23 Airpass on the English Electric Lightning maintaining a direct lineage to Bowen's original work. Modern fighters like the Tornado ADV with its AI.24 Foxhunter radar, or contemporary aircraft with their sophisticated pulse Doppler radars and active electronically scanned arrays, all descend from the crude green screens that John Philipson watched in the back of a Beaufighter on that November night in 1940. More broadly, the night fighter campaign demonstrated several principles that remain relevant to air warfare today. First, it showed that technological advantage can overcome numerical superiority and offset disadvantageous strategic circumstances. In 1940, Britain was outnumbered, on the defensive and struggling to survive. But by investing in radar technology and developing the tactics and organization to exploit it, the RAF transformed its night fighter force from an ineffective token resistance into a war-winning weapon system. Second, it demonstrated the critical importance of system integration. AI radar alone was not enough. It required GCI radar, reliable communications, well-trained crews, suitable aircraft, and an organizational structure that could coordinate all these elements effectively. This system's approach to warfare, which seems obvious in hindsight, was revolutionary in 1940 and remains central to military thinking today. Third, the campaign showed that even a relatively small force can have a strategic impact if it is employed correctly. At its peak, RAF night fighter squadrons numbered fewer than 40, with perhaps 200 aircraft operational at any given time. This was a tiny fraction of the total RAF, yet these units effectively ended the Blitz and prevented any further German strategic bombing of Britain. They achieved this not through massive firepower or overwhelming numbers, but through technological superiority and tactical excellence. Every interception was a complex operation requiring precision and skill, but when executed successfully, the results were devastating. A single Beaufighter or Mosquito, flown by a skilled crew, could destroy multiple bombers in a single sortie, and the cumulative effect over weeks and months was decisive. The intelligence dimension of the night fighter war also established patterns that continue to influence modern conflict. The British went to extraordinary lengths to conceal the true capabilities of their radar systems, using everything from the absurd carrots improve night vision story to strict censorship of technical details. Meanwhile, they worked continuously to understand German radar development and to identify weaknesses that could be exploited. This contest between concealment and revelation, between security and intelligence gathering, created a hidden dimension to the air war that was every bit as important as the shooting itself. When one side achieved a technological breakthrough, as Britain did with centimetric radar, the impact could be profound, but only if that advantage could be protected and exploited before the enemy developed countermeasures. The night fighter campaign also highlighted the importance of learning and adaptation in warfare. The first AI-equipped Blenheims that went to number 25 Squadron in 1939 achieved virtually nothing because the system wasn't ready and the training was inadequate. But instead of abandoning the concept, the RAF persisted, learning from failures and gradually developing the skills and procedures necessary for success. By 1941, those hard-won lessons had crystallized into effective doctrine that could be taught to new crews. This institutional learning, the ability to fail, adapt, and improve, was arguably as important as the technology itself. The Luftwaffe failed to demonstrate similar adaptability, clinging to outdated tactics and underestimating British capabilities until it was too late to recover. For German bomber crews who flew through that terrible gauntlet, the invisible enemy became a permanent nightmare. Even veterans who survived dozens of missions never lost their fear of the darkness, never felt safe despite the protection that night supposedly offered. They flew with one eye on the darkness behind them, listening for the first whisper of cannon fire that would mean death was already upon them. The crews that survived, and many did not, carried those memories for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades after the war, German veterans would speak with undimmed terror about the invisible hunters that had stalked them through the night skies over England. They had faced enemy they could not see, could not fight, and could barely comprehend, and the experience had marked them indelibly. The reversal of fortunes between 1940 and 1942 was nearly absolute. In September 1940, the Luftwaffe could attack British cities at night with near impunity, suffering losses of perhaps 2 to 3%, an acceptable rate that could be sustained indefinitely. By May 1941, loss rates on some raids were approaching 10%, which was catastrophic and forced the abandonment of the campaign. When the Baedeker raids were attempted in 1942, German losses were even worse, reaching levels that made continued operations suicidal. The weapon that achieved this transformation was not a massive fleet of interceptors or a revolutionary new aircraft design. It was a relatively small number of radar-equipped night fighters flown by exceptionally skilled crews, backed by the world's most advanced air defense system. The technology continued to evolve through the war years. AI-Mk8 radar, introduced in late 1942, used centimetric wavelengths that provided much better resolution and were harder for the enemy to detect or jam. AI-Mk9, which entered service in 1943, offered further improvements in range and accuracy. By 1944, RAF night fighters were so sophisticated that they could effectively hunt German night fighters that were themselves hunting RAF bombers over Germany, a multi-layered aerial chess game conducted in complete darkness with radar as the only means of detection. The introduction of the Mosquito MKXXX with its AI-MKX radar in late 1944 represented the pinnacle of wartime night fighter development. An aircraft that could cruise at over 400 miles per hour with a combat radius of several hundred miles, equipped with radar that could detect targets at 5 miles or more with great precision, and armed with 4 20mm cannons that could destroy any aircraft with a single burst. The post-war world inherited not just the technology but the entire concept of the radar-equipped all-weather interceptor. The Cold War fighters that stood guard against Soviet bomber streams, aircraft like the American F-89 Scorpion, F-94 Starfire, and later the F-4 Phantom with its pulse Doppler radar, were direct descendants of Cunningham's Beaufighters and Burbridge's Mosquitoes. Modern fighters like the F-15, F-16, F/A-18, and Typhoon, with their sophisticated electronically scanned array radars capable of tracking dozens of targets simultaneously at ranges of over 100 miles, represent the culmination of developments that began in that makeshift laboratory at Bawdsey Manor in 1936. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Use electromagnetic radiation to detect, track, and target enemy aircraft beyond visual range. Then close for the kill using information that the enemy doesn't have. Perhaps the most profound legacy, though, is psychological rather than technological. The night fighter campaign of 1940-41 demonstrated that technological innovation could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that small investments in the right capabilities could yield strategic dividends far exceeding their cost, and that even in the darkest hours, literally and figuratively, there was reason for hope if courage could be combined with ingenuity. For Britain, facing potential invasion and systematic destruction from the air, the night fighter force represented proof that the war was not hopeless, that German advantages could be neutralized, and that ultimate victory was possible. The young men who flew those early radar-equipped Beaufighters into the darkness over England, knowing that their equipment was experimental and their tactics untested, demonstrated a particular kind of courage that deserves to be remembered alongside the more celebrated heroics of the Daylight Battle of Britain. The story of RAF night fighters is ultimately a story about seeing what others cannot see, about fighting battles in conditions where normal human capabilities are inadequate, and about the marriage of courage with technology to achieve results that neither could accomplish alone. John Cunningham, Brance Burbridge, Edward Bowen, and thousands of others whose names are less well known created something entirely new in the autumn and winter of 1940. A weapon system that rendered darkness not a shield but a hunting ground. The German bomber crews who died in flames over England, never knowing what had killed them, were the victims not just of technology but of imagination, the imagination to conceive of radar-guided night fighting, the determination to make it work despite countless obstacles, and the skill to execute it with deadly efficiency. That achievement changed the course of World War II, saved countless British lives, and established principles that continue to govern air combat into the 21st century. The invisible enemy that haunted Luftwaffe crews in 1941 has become the standard for how modern air forces fight at night, in weather, and beyond visual range, a direct lineage from a handful of pioneering crews groping through the darkness with crude radar sets to today's networked fighters with synthetic aperture radars and beyond visual range missiles. The ghosts that stalked the night skies over England 85 years ago have never really disappeared. They simply evolved, became more capable, and established a template for aerial warfare that endures to this day.